Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, and welcome back to CLS Social Studies. Today we're going to be covering our third and final installment of Post-World War II America, the American Economy, and Post-War America. So on the home front, things were not going great in the United States for everyone. As the GIs returned home from the war, women and African Americans were expected to leave their jobs for the returning white soldiers. Inflation soared as many items that were not for sale during the war all sold out. Unions were forcing their workers to strike for more pay, and African Americans were fighting to keep their jobs. The amount of discrimination that was felt by the African Americans was immense. They were returning home as war heroes and were still not feeling the results of the Double V campaign. Harry Truman won the presidency in 1948 and was a big supporter of civil rights. He passed Executive Order 9981, which stopped all segregation in the armed forces and ended racial discrimination when hiring for the federal government. While Truman's plan, the Fair Deal, was a large step for civil rights, it did not go over well with everyone in Congress. The fight for civil rights will wage on for many years to come. So, for many generations of Americans, America promised a dream of material prosperity. Immigrants came to America to live a better life, a life filled with material possessions and riches. However, for many of these Americans, it was still a dream. Prior to World War II, the Roaring Twenties gave Americans a brief glimpse of things to come, and for millions of Americans in the 1950s, the American dream became reality. Finally, within their reach was the chance to own a house on their own land, a car, and a family. Gone was the poverty born of the Great Depression, and the years of wartime sacrifice were over. The economy was booming, and this is the reason why the 1950s were called the Happy Days, like the TV sitcom. During the war, automobile dealers were called on to produce war supplies, and now cars once again rolled off the assembly lines. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler again began to make their mark on the American economy. The Interstate Highway Act authorized the construction of thousands of miles of high-speed roads that made long-distance vacationing and living farther from work a possibility. GIs returning from war were eager to reunite with their girlfriends or wives. Pre-World War II Americans were living in the Great Depression, and during the war, they were rationing everything they could. For this reason, families were put on the back burner. Post-World War II, families had that delayed having additional children for years no longer waited, and the nation enjoyed a post-war baby boom. These baby boomers were the largest population boom in U.S. history, with over 70 million children born in the decade. Factories that have filled the cities in the north and eastern part of the United States were getting tired of paying high taxes and surviving the miserable winters. With the nation's economy prospering, businesses decided to make some changes as well. A line on the map that had originally been used to separate free and slave states now had a more distinguished reason to exist. Below the 36-degree line is now what is to become known as the Sun Belt. This area of the United States experiences year-round nice weather and was offering huge tax breaks to companies if they were willing to move from the industrious north to the flourishing south. The South begins to experience the industry they longed for. So here are a couple of pictures of the 1950s America, post-World War America. This guy gave his wife a washer and dryer for Valentine's Day, presumably with the heart. This lady's very excited because she has a brand new stove. The streets of the cities are going to be filled with cars. The baby boom. You have millions of babies born after World War II. And these are quite possibly like my favorite. Of course, McDonald's. Everybody loves McDonald's, right? And then you have this new spinner washer, the Thor water and soap saver. But by far, this General Electric machine right here is my favorite. You can cook and wash on your refrigerator. So you have your refrigerator here with a stove connected to it and a sink. All of the conveniences in one super modern day appliance. I love it. So once the migrating place of many Americans, a certain group of people were now leaving the cities in record numbers for a plethora of reasons. White Americans were leaving the compact concrete jungle for the more roomy suburbs. Reasons like affordable housing, land acquisition, racial fears, and the desire to leave decaying cities were all factors that prompted many white Americans to flee from the cities of old to what we now call suburbia. William Levitt was contracted by the federal government during World War II to quickly and cheaply build housing for military personnel. Levitt used the techniques of mass production and his craft to design villages of cookie-cutter houses. In 1947, he set out to erect the largest planned living community in the United States on farmland he had purchased on Long Island, New York. Levitt identified 27 different steps to build a house. Therefore, 27 different teams of builders were hired to construct the homes. These cookie-cutter houses had 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and no basement. The kitchen was situated at the back of the house so mothers could keep an eye on their children playing in the backyard. Within 1 year, Levitt was building 36 houses per day. His assembly line approach made the houses extremely affordable. At first, the homes were available only to veterans. Eventually, though, Levitt towns were open to all others as well. With the ability of many Americans to now own their own home, the standard of living had surpassed that of their parents. However, this string of successes was not without its critics. Many Americans believed that Levitt towns emphasized conformity. Homeowners had to make sure that their lawns were mowed on certain days, mailboxes were the same, and houses painted a certain color. Critics said that the suburbs were discriminatory because African Americans were excluded by practice, and life was based on the purchase and use of consumer goods. The irrational need to keep up with the Joneses was born in the American suburb. Even though there was criticism, many Americans jumped at the chance to leave the filthy cities and live on their own land in their own house. Soon, shopping centers and fast food restaurants added to the convenience of suburban life. America and the American dream would never be the same. Now, there are many changes that occur post-World War II in American culture. After the war had ended in 1945, televisions were a novelty item in the home of the wealthy. Only a few thousand Americans owned television. By 1955, 2/3 of American families owned televisions, and by 1960, roughly 90% of Americans owned a TV. TV dinners became a thing. Presidents can now be seen on TV rather than just heard on the radio. Americans, on average, watch 6 hours of television per day. Another change in culture was the music. While many American parents were thriving in the suburbs listening to big bands and Frank Sinatra, many young Americans were twisting, thrusting, bumping, and grinding to the sounds of rock and roll. Rock and roll reflected their desire to rebel against adult authority. Other forms of 1950s popular culture, such as movies and television, sought to entertain while reinforcing values such as religious faith, patriotism, and conformity to societal norms. By far the greatest challenge to Hollywood, however, came from the relatively new medium of television. Although the technology had been developed in the late 1920s, through much of the 1940s, only a fairly small, wealthy audience had access to it. As a result, programming had been limited. Various types of programs were broadcast on the handful of major networks: situation comedies, variety programs, game shows, soap operas, talk shows, medical dramas, adventure series, cartoons, and police procedurals. Many comedies presented an idealized image of white suburban family life. Happy housewife mothers, wise fathers, and mischievous but not dangerously rebellious children were constants on shows like Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best in the late 1950s. These shows also reinforced certain perspectives on the value of individualism and family, values that came to be redefined as American in opposition to alleged communist collectivism. Westerns, which stressed unity in the face of danger and the ability to survive in a hostile environment, were popular too. Programming designed specifically for children began to emerge and was shows as Captain Kangaroo, Romper Room, and the Mickey Mouse Club, designed to appeal to members of the baby boom. So let's cruise to rock and roll. In the late 1940s, some white country musicians began to experiment with the rhythms of the blues, a decades-old musical genre of rural southern black people. This experimentation led to the creation of new musical form known as rockabilly. By the 1950s, rockabilly had developed into rock and roll. Rock and roll music celebrated themes such as young love and freedom from the oppression of middle-class society. It quickly grew in favor among American teens during the 1950s, thanks largely to the efforts of disc jockey Alan Freed. Freed named and popularized rock and roll by playing it on the radio in Cleveland, where he also organized the first rock and roll concert, and later in New York. The theme of rebellion against authority, present in many rock and roll songs, appealed to teens. In 1954, rock group Bill Haley and the Comets provided youth with an anthem for their rebellion with his song, Rock Around the Clock. The song used in 1955 movie Blackboard Jungle about a white teacher at a troubled inner-city school seemed to be calling for teens to declare their independence from adult control. Haley illustrated how white artists could take musical motifs from African-American musicians and achieve mainstream success. Teen heartthrob Elvis Presley rose to stardom doing the same. Thus, besides encouraging the feelings of youthful rebellion, rock and roll also began to tear down color barriers in popular culture as white youth sought out African-American musicians such as Chuck Berry and Little Richard. While youth had found an outlet for their feelings and concerns, their parents were much less enthused about rock and roll and the rebellion and sexuality it seemed to promote. Many regarded the music as a threat to American values. When Elvis Presley appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, a popular television variety program, the camera deliberately focused on his torso and did not show his swiveling hips or legs shaking in the time to the music. Despite adults' dislike of the genre, or perhaps because of it, more than 68% of the music played on the radio in 1956 was rock and roll. So many Americans criticized the new American way. America was not the white family that you see living on TV. The American middle class was emerging in great numbers. However, there was poverty, racism, and alienation in America that was rarely depicted on TV. Minorities, women, Latino, African Americans, and Native Americans were the largest force of criticism in the United States. Minorities seemed to be shut out from the emerging American dream, and women were tired of having to be a stay-at-home mom. Many women wanted to stay working and have an impact on society. Poverty rates for African Americans were typically double those of white Americans. Segregation in schools, the lack of political voice, and long-standing racial prejudices stifled the economic advances of many African Americans. Latino Americans languished in urban American barrios, and the Eisenhower administration responded with a program designed to deport millions of Mexican Americans. Native American poverty ran strong as well. Eisenhower ended federal support for tribes. Incentives such as relocation assistance and job placement were offered to Native Americans who were willing to venture off the reservations and into cities. Unfortunately, the government excelled at relocation, but struggled with job placement, leading to the creation of Native American ghettos in many Western cities. All right, guys, that ends our 3 parts coverage of post-World War II America into the Civil War. And now we are going to continue this criticism of the new American public when we talk about the modern-day civil rights movement. I'll see you next time.